We've started going through the book of Joshua, and we're up to chapters 5 and 6 this morning. Perhaps the most famous story, the most famous battle that you're going to find in the entire book, maybe one of the most famous battles that you're going to find in the entire Old Testament. It's the Battle of Jericho that we're going to be talking about today. If you want to turn in your Bibles to Joshua chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 13. While you're turning there, though, I want to talk a little bit about this lady. This might hang in there with me for just a few minutes. It might sound kind of weird. This lady's name is Catherine Birbalsingh, Birbalsingh. She is the head mistress of a school over in England. I guess that'd be comparable to a school principal over here in the United States. She is the head mistress of this school. It's called the Michaela School. It's an inner city school in London on the Upper West Side. It was founded in 2014, and it took several years to get this school going because there was so much opposition, and I really don't have time to get into the background of this, but it's a fascinating story. Why in the world am I telling you about this lady? Because she's an educator, and she works with this school, and this school, before I tell you about this school, it's important to know it is not a school that screens their students. You know, there are some schools out there that can say, hey, you know, half of our graduates end up in prestigious colleges and we have all these academic achievements. Well, before the kids ever came to the school, they had to meet certain criteria, right? They had to pass certain tests, and because they were certain caliber of student, they allowed them in the school in the first place. They don't do that at her school. In fact, this is an inner city school, and as an inner city school, they represent all sorts of racial backgrounds, all sorts of economic backgrounds. In fact, it's tilted towards the lower middle class and lower class as far as economic status, right? And so as far as advantages, they have practically none. Why do I think that's important to know? Because this school, since it was formed, they've added a year each year, and they finally, in the last few years, have had a complete school. So they've had testing over there, all the testing that is done by the government in England. And they've been, since they started the testing, they were going up through the ranks. They've only been around for 10 years. The last 2 years of the 4,000 schools, they're number one. 4,000 schools that they, academically. Now I don't know about you. I'm on the outside looking in because this is, you know, I'm a minister. I do my life. I appreciate what educators do and things like that. But it seems to me if you're grading a hospital or you're grading a surgeon, one of the things you want to see is are sick people getting well, right? And if you're grading a school, it just seems to me maybe academics ought to come in there somewhere. Are they learning information, right? And as far as the 4,000 schools that they actually go in and evaluate and put to the test, they are number one, and they've been number one for 2 years running. And because of that, people from all over the globe come and they visit this school because they want to know, you know, what's the secret sauce? What's the magic here? What are you guys doing? And one of the things that I accidentally found out about this lady just a couple months ago. Since that time, I've listened to hours of interviews, and I've listened to her speeches as well, and I find it extremely fascinating. I need to tell you right up front, though, she's not a Christian. This is not a Christian school, and that's not why I'm bringing this up. Man, I'm getting off track here. Let me get back to the story. Not only are they academically number one, people from all over the world come in to look at this school because they're just so, wow, how in the world do you achieve what you achieve? And one of the things that you can't help but to notice when you visit this school is there are no cliques. There are no groups of kids picking on other kids. It's as though everybody, maybe it's just a facade, but it's as though everybody likes everybody else. Different racial backgrounds, different economic backgrounds, and it's like either they're putting on a great show or they really do like one another. They have lunchtime together, and the way they have their lunchtime in the cafeteria, they're around these big tables, they're family meals. And every group of, all these groups, and I guess they mix them up different groups all the time, but the groups, they have a question of the day, and they have to talk about this question over the meal times. And if you just happen by the tables, they're actually having decent conversations over the subject of the day, right? And then they conclude the meal time with one representative. I don't know how they do this. They just, I don't know, toss the dice or whatever. But they pick one kid from each table, and they say, hey, what are you thankful for today? And the kids stand up, and they're actually thankful for stuff, right? And you're thinking to yourself, this is a public school? Yeah, it's an inner city public school. One other thing that I find very fascinating is visitors can't help but to notice they have this, I don't even know what they call it. I'm going to call it a phone bank, a place where you put your cell phone, right? And so one of the professors from the United States who was over there evaluating the school said, oh, that's one of the secrets, isn't it? Because you don't allow them to have their cell phone in class. And she said, no, that's not a rule. They can have their cell phone in class if they want to. The kids themselves decide to put their cell phone there because they don't want to be distracted. In fact, the students at the school regularly leave their cell phone overnight, and if there's a big test next week, they leave it over the weekend because they don't want to be distracted from their studies. That's how motivated they are. Man, I could go on. I'm not going to go on. I just want to move to the punchline. Here's the punchline, because everybody wants to know, how do you do it? And here's the number one answer that Catherine will give. Repeatedly, if you hear her give a presentation, she usually starts by saying, I am the strictest teacher in the world. She thinks strictness is a sign of love for children. In fact, one of the presentations I was listening to her, she said, you know what, if you were to Google the strictest teacher in the world, you'd see a picture of me. So I stopped the video, I got out my phone, strictest teacher in the world. That's the picture that came up. It's like, wow, she must really be, somebody's checking me out right now. Strictest teacher in the world. There she is. Well, here's the principle, and I want to do this real quickly, but here's her idea. If you really want to, she's all about education. You really want to teach kids, right? Here's what she will say to parents, and she applies this to teachers. When your children are little, you've got a choice. You can either be friends with your children when they're little, or you can be friends with them when they're adults. But you cannot have both. She might be overstating the point, but listen to what she's trying to say. If what you mean by being friends with your children is you let them decide what they're going to eat, you let them decide when they're going to go to bed, and you let them decide when they're going to study and stuff like that because you want to be friends with your kids. You can be friends with them now, but understand this, they're going to hate you when they grow up. But you can be the adult, and you can be the parent, and you can decide, I want to have a friendship with them when they're adults, and so as a child, I am going to be the parent here. And what does that mean? I'm not going to be your friend. Sorry, you got to eat your vegetables. You got to go to bed. And you got to study. I'm going to set up the parameters. She says she thinks that's a great sign of love, and educators ought to use it. That's the founding basic principle of their school. What is it? We have boundaries. There are certain things you cannot do, and there are expectations that you must do. And you are rewarded when you do these things, and guess what? You are punished, and you get demerits when you do not do them. And we enforce these boundaries, and since everybody knows they have these boundaries, they do not have choices. Here are the boundaries. You can live within them or not, and there's consequences associated with these, both good and bad. The children thrive. They're number one. Okay, now, Mark, why you're spending so much time talking about this? Michaela School. I'll tell you why. God is our Father. Can I say it this way? He's not our buddy. He's our Heavenly Father, and He's God. Many times He's presented as our Heavenly Father. You know what that means, to present Him as our Heavenly Father? It means He's the one who decides. This is what you do, and this is what you don't do. Listen, I am just convinced, and I really think, I hope you see this as we go to the passages today. But so many times we have in our lives goals. And sometimes those goals are good, and we think to ourselves, you know, I want to accomplish this, and if I can just get here, man, life will be wonderful, and I'll ask God to bless my plans. But if we would, instead of asking God to bless our plans, say, God, you're God, what are your plans? Instead of us reaching a certain level in life, if we would give up those goals and say, God, you're God, you set the standards, what I should be doing with my life, and I'll follow you. Man, the roof gets blown out. Listen to this. Before we even get to the passage in Joshua chapter 5, I want to read a couple verses from the New Testament. This is Jesus speaking. It's in Luke chapter 9, very famous verses. You've probably heard this before. But in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, He says to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple, my follower, if you want to come after me, you must deny yourself, take up your cross daily. Take up your cross daily and follow me. And you understand what he's talking about when he talks about who carried the cross in that day? Who carries the cross in the New Testament? It's Jesus right before he's crucified on the cross. You know what Jesus is saying? They understood this. They saw crucifixion. He's saying, put your neck in the hangman's noose. Sit in the electric chair. Take up your cross. The point he's making is, would you stop trying to live your life, put an end to that, and say, God, what's the life you want me to live? He says, that's what you've got to do. In the very next verse, after he says that, if you're going to be my follower, that's what you've got to do on a daily basis. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will save it. Man, if you would just give up these dreams, they're so much lower than the dreams that God has. In fact, here's in a nutshell, it's very, very basic, but in a nutshell, here's the message of Jericho. God's not on our side. He wants us to be on His side. When we finally figure out we're supposed to be on His side, then we get the promised land. Are you ready for this? Joshua chapter 5. This is starting in verse 13. As Joshua is checking out the area near Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went up to him and he asked, are you for us or our enemies? Neither. Some translations will say more bluntly, no. In other words, it's wrong question here. Are you on our side or are you on their side? And this person, he doesn't even know who it is yet, says no. He replied, but as the commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground. Why in the world is he falling face down to the ground? Because Joshua understands something right away. In reverence, he falls down and he asks him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. When you read about the angel of the Lord or the commander of the Lord's army in the Old Testament, usually what you're talking about here is not an angel. It's not a normal angel. How do we know that? Because in the book of Revelation, 2 different times, in fact, it's not just in the book of Revelation, but in the book of Revelation, 2 different times, John is so overwhelmed by the greatness of the revelation that's been given to him that he falls down and he starts to worship the angel. It's like, whoa, this is wonderful. And he falls down and worships, and the angel quickly says, stop that. I'm just an angel. You're not supposed to worship me. Angels do not accept worship. It's one of the points of Hebrews, the first chapter, by the way. But angels do not accept worship. This man does. Why? Because this is not a normal angel. This is a physical presentation, physical manifestation of God Himself. When was the last time in Scripture somebody was told to take their sandals off their feet? It was the guy who was leading singing up here this morning. No. It was Moses, right? It was Moses before the burning bush. Why was he told to take the sandals off his feet? Because he was in the presence of God. Joshua obviously got this. Okay, so if he's in the presence of God, can we boil this down? I know it's basic, but let's go over this anyway. What's the message? He says, are you on our side? Are you on their side? And his answer is, no. In other words, Joshua, if you want to have victories here, you got to understand this. I'm not here to bless your plans. You need to be here to figure out what my plans are. Have you ever done that? Have you ever brought your plans to God and say, God, would you bless this? Would you bless that? Would you bless this? God, would you just help me out here? Instead of saying, God, what would you have me do? Well, he has this encounter with God, and you go on in the 6th chapter, and here's the battle plan. It says in the very first verse that the city is tightly shut up. Why is it tightly shut up? Because people inside the city know who's out there. They've already heard what happened in Egypt. They know about the God of the Israelites. So here's the battle plan. It goes right on from this encounter. He wants to know what the battle plan is. And so here's God's plan. Here's God's plan. God's plan is, listen, I want you to get all your army out. I want you to get the priests. I want you to take the Ark of the Covenant. And I want you to you're supposed to carry it the prescribed way with the poles, the way it was designed to be carried. But then I want you to get 7 priests with ram's horns, right? And I want you to have the 7 priests with the ram's horns go out in front of the Ark of the Covenant. What is the Ark of the Covenant, by the way? It's that piece of furniture that they put in the Holy of Holies. It, again, represented the very presence of God, right? So they're supposed to carry this, and there's supposed to be 7 priests out in front with the ram's horn. And what are they doing? They're blowing the horns. So if there's a whole bunch of people around, and by the way, if there's a big crowd of people and nobody's saying a word, everybody's quiet, but then all of a sudden some people over here start blowing a trumpet, what does everybody do? We all look in that direction, right? That's the whole purpose. It's drawing attention to what? It's drawing attention to the Ark of the Covenant, which represents the presence of God. He says, I want you to have some of the soldiers, some of the army out in front. Then I want you to have the rest of the army in the rear. But right there in the middle, I want you to have the Ark of the Covenant with these 7 priests blowing the trumpets. And I want you to go out and I want you to march around the city. Everybody's supposed to be quiet. The only noise you've got are these priests blowing their trumpets. Everybody's drawing attention. Can you imagine people inside Jericho looking over the walls, looking out there? Everybody's going to be looking at not just the army marching around, but they're blowing the trumpets, and the focus is right there, right? The focus of all the Israelites is right there on the presence of God. God is with us. They do that one day, and he says, the next day I want you to do the same thing. The third day, the same thing. I want you to do that 6 days in a row. And the 7th day, I want you to do the exact same thing, but this time I want you to march around the city 7 times. And then after marching around the city 7 times, you've been quiet the whole time except the ram's horns, right? After the 7 times marching around the 7th day, then I want you to blast the trumpets, and then you can tell the people to shout. And when the people shout, then the walls are going to come down. God's going to bring the walls down. You're going to have a great victory. You know the story of the Battle of Jericho, right? But when you read this in chapter 6, this is so interesting because here's what happens. He explains to the people, this is what God says, this is what we're going to do. And on the 7th day, when they march around 7 times, Joshua finally stands up and says, shout. But instead of him saying, shout, and everybody shouts, and the walls come down, that's not what happens. Joshua stands up and he says, okay, shout and remember, we're not supposed to take any of the stuff that we get in the city. Everything we get, God's going to give to us. You're going to get vineyards you did not plant. You're going to get land that you did not acquire with your own money. God is going to richly bless you. But the first thing, number 1, first city, first conquest, first fruits, right? You give the spoils to God. And then the second thing he says is he says there's a lady by the name of Rahab. She and her family have been faithful to God. Why? Because they heard about God, what he did. They made the decision to follow God. So we're going to spare her and her whole family and whoever's with her. So he doesn't just say shout and they shout. He says shout and remember God first. And remember, everybody who puts God first gets the victory too. And so they shouted, the walls come down, and they have a great victory. And the point is simply this. It's not our plan. In fact, who in the world would devise a plan like that? I'm so sorry, but every time I think of this, I think of going to the doctor, you're hurting really bad, and you sit down in the doctor's office, you say, man, can you give me something for this pain? And the doctor says, well, tell you what, Mark, stand up, walk around my desk, sit back down. Do you feel better now? I'd be like, I need another doctor. Why in the world does walking around a desk? Or if he tells me to go home and walk around my house for 7 days, what in the world would that doesn't make sense? And that's part of the point. It may not make sense. But it's God. Are you going to let God be God? It's not our plans. It's not on our side. We're supposed to be on his side. We're on his side. We finally get the promised land. That's the message for them. I think that's the message for us, too. I really do. Just 2 weeks ago, a little less than 2 weeks ago, I happened upon an interview of this lady right here. Her name's Patty Height. She was interviewed by this guy here. His name's Becket Cook. I don't know if you ever listened to Becket Cook's show. He interviews a lot of different people, and he talks about usually what brought them to the Lord. And that's what he was doing in interviewing this lady. She's been a Christian for several years, but the reason I'm telling you this story is I think she's just a perfect example of what I'm talking about this morning, what I think the Bible's trying to get across to us. When I started listening to this interview, the first thing that just grabbed me is how I couldn't turn the channel. Because this lady, it's as though, the word that comes to my mind is bubbly. I don't know if that word works for you, but it's like somebody has had a huge weight they've carried all their life lifted off their shoulders. It's like somebody has found an answer that they've been looking for their whole life. You could just tell it on her face. She couldn't stop smiling while she was speaking. She just kind of had this internal joy. Have you seen people like that at different times of their life? It's kind of like, wow, this is I just want to hear her story because it was just so delightful to listen to her talk. And then when you listen to her talk, her story was awful. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details, but you need to get a feel for this to understand what's going on here. By age 12, because of some sexual abuse that took place in her life, she did not go into the details. I'm glad she didn't. But by age 12, she was getting drunk on a regular basis. Can you imagine this? As a 12-year-old girl, she'd be so drunk she'd pass out in the backyard in the middle of the night because she was staying out with her friends, and her parents would find her passed out in the backyard. She couldn't even make it inside the house. She was an alcoholic. She was into drugs. In fact, age 12, she's already using LSD. And why is she doing all this stuff? She would later say it's because she wanted to numb herself. She didn't want to think about life because of the abuse and some other things. She'd rather, my words, not hers, she would rather bury her head in the sand to go through life, right? Didn't want to think about life. So that's how she coped. She coped with the drugs and the alcohol. Well, there were a lot of other things going on in her life at that time, and it went on from the time she's 12 through her teenage years, through most of her 20s. It wasn't until, if I understand this correctly, late 20s, early 30s, her brother, who she always, older brother, she had a decent relationship with him, older brother that she always thought well of, by this time in her life, he's living in a different state and he gets cancer. And so she's obviously concerned. She makes an opportunity to go visit him once or twice. And one of the visits that she has with her brother, suffering from, I don't even know what kind of cancer it is, but one of the visits that she has with her brother, she said his whole demeanor had changed. And it's like, wow. And positive, right? And so she says to her brother, she says, well, did they cure the cancer? Are you in remission? Did you get good news from the doctor? What is it? And her brother said, no, it has nothing to do with the cancer. It's my neighbor. My neighbor's been coming over and he's been reading these things to me. They're called Gospels. They're the neatest thing. It's all about this guy named Jesus. And you could just see, his face was kind of lit up because he found real hope in the message of Scripture. Nobody had ever read the Bible to him before. He knew nothing, next to nothing about it. Patty, grew up in the same home, knew nothing. I guess they had gone to church once or twice before on a Christmas holiday or something like that, but knew nothing about Christianity. But the fact that her brother found hope in this, that's something that made her feel good. But it also made her feel bad. Because by this time in her life, Patty was living with her girlfriend. She was in a lesbian lifestyle. And her immediate thought was this. She's thinking, well, I'm glad he's happy, and I hope he finds joy in this, but I bet he hates me now. But you know what? He never voiced any hatred in her direction. All he ever focused on was the hope that he had found in Christ, and it was just a positive message. So that left a positive impression on her, because it wasn't very long after that he died. So he becomes a follower of Christ. I don't know any of the details. Finds out about Jesus. Not much longer after that, he dies. And when he died, though, Patty said they told her he died with a Bible on his chest. And again, her thought was this: I bet you he's in heaven. And then her second thought was this: I bet I'll never be there. All the choices she had made in her life to bury her pain, at one level, she knew they were all wrong choices, but she was still making those choices, right? So it wasn't long after that, and I'm just giving you the highlights. Man, she goes into such vivid detail on some of these things. But she's at home. She's got a house with her girlfriend, and she said one morning, she just decided to talk to her girlfriend seriously, and she said to her girlfriend, she said, do you ever think that maybe the way we're living's not right? And her girlfriend got this shocked look on her face, and she said to Patty, I was going to ask you the same thing today. And so Patty tells her, well, my brother found hope in reading the Bible. I wonder if the Bible's got any answers for us. I wonder where we can find a Bible. And her girlfriend said, years ago somebody gave me a Bible. I think it's in one of the boxes up in the attic. So they went up in the attic and they rummaged through some of the old boxes and found an old Bible. And they came back downstairs, true story, and by the way, I am not recommending this. But they prayed a prayer together. She and her girlfriend prayed this prayer. God, if we're not living the way you want us to live, would you please show us? And they did one of these things, right? Where you flip the Bible open. That's what I'm not recommending you do. An average Bible, they just flipped the Bible open and went like this, right? So they prayed this prayer, God, if we're not living the way you want us to, would you please show us? They prayed that prayer. They flopped open. An average English translation has like 2,000 pages, right? You know where their Bible fell open? Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus chapter 18. It's the strongest statement you're going to find anywhere in the Bible about homosexual relationships. What are the chances? They read that passage, and then it's like, let's close this Bible, goosebumps, all that stuff. They went a few days, and then they decided, we probably need some help with this. They decided to go to church. She didn't say what kind of church. She didn't say the name of the church. She didn't say any of that stuff. But she said they went to church. And the first Sunday, they liked some things they found very strange, they didn't like, but they came back. Second time they came to church, Patty said, I was sitting next to my girlfriend, I looked at her, and here's the way she said it. The last thing I ever said as a lesbian was, I'm going up. Because at the end of the service, she decided to come forward. And again, she doesn't go into a lot of details here. I don't know if they baptized her at that very moment, that day, or they talked to her first. I don't know a lot of the details. All I know is this, and there's the whole reason I'm telling you the story. I know it doesn't always happen this way, but here's what Patty says, and if you would just see her bubbly expression, it's so engaging. Here's what she said. That day, she said, since that day, I haven't had a drink. I haven't had the urge for any drugs. I haven't used any drugs. Haven't had any sexual lesbian desires. She said, on that day that I decided I made a mess of my life, I can't run my life, I need to let God run my life, she said, all of it went away. You know how I would say that? I would say when she finally decided to let God be God, she found her promised land. Do you get it? I know some of the details, it doesn't always happen that way, but the principle is true. It was a principle God was making to Israel, and it's a principle that Jesus is making to his followers. You've got to take up your cross, and we've got to stop asking God to bless our plans. He's not on our side. He wants us on his side. And then you're going to find a life better than you ever dreamed. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be better. This is a time in our service where we have communion. We have communion because Jesus tells us when we come together, we're supposed to stop and remember his death. That's why we take a cup and there's bread and there's juice to remember the life that he lived and the death that he died. The juice represents his blood spilling out for us. And we usually focus on the fact that death was a sacrifice that got us right with God, and that's true. But one of the most amazing things about remembering Jesus' death is the fact that he didn't stay dead. He didn't stay dead. Jesus' death proved that he had the power over death. Do you understand what I'm asking you to think? So many things in life seem so insurmountable. How in the world can you conquer this? I tell you, you can't. But there's one who conquered everything. He conquered death. And he can conquer anything you face. If you let him.